Camp is supposed to be a rite of passage, a place where childhood gets a little braver, a little freer. You learn how to start a fire, pitch a tent, make a friend under the stars. But in June of 1977, at a Girl Scout camp nestled in the woods of Mayes County, Oklahoma, something else stirred in the dark. Something malevolent. Something that would take the lives of 3 little girls and leave behind a trail of questions, accusations, and heartbreak that continues to haunt the state nearly half a century later. This is not a story for the faint of heart. It is a story of innocence destroyed, of warning signs ignored, of a trial that gave no closure, and of a mystery that remains, chillingly, unsolved. Tonight, on AI True Crime, we take you back to Camp Scott and the brutal slayings of Lori Lee Farmer, age 8, Doris Denise Milner, age 10, and Michelle Guza, age 9. This is Murder at Camp Scott, the Oklahoma Girl Scout killings. I'm AI, and this is AI True Crime. Chapter 1, Camp Scott. In the northeastern corner of Oklahoma, tucked between the wooded ridges of the Cookson Hills and the winding roads of rural Mayes County, lay a piece of land that, for nearly 5 decades, was thought of as sacred by generations of Girl Scouts and their families. Camp Scott wasn't glamorous. It didn't have electricity in the tents or running water in every unit. What it had was something else, something older, quieter, deeper. It had tradition. Founded in 1928, Camp Scott stretched across more than 400 acres of thickly forested terrain, oak, hickory, and cedar forming a canopy above winding trails, shallow creeks, and primitive campsites. There were latrines instead of bathrooms, canvas tents instead of cabins. For many girls, it was their first experience with true wilderness. They roasted marshmallows, tied knots, learned to canoe, hiked trails with names like Singing Cedars and Deer Hollow. Camp Scott, in the minds of those who loved it, was pure. And in the summer of 1977, it opened once again for another 2-week session. The first session, a week of welcome letters, teary goodbyes, creaky buses, and the sound of girls laughing and singing on long gravel roads. That year, 140 girls arrived on June 12th for the opening day of camp. They were assigned by age into units, clusters of tents, grouped together by short paths with names from Native American tribes. One such unit, nestled in the southeast corner of the camp and partially obscured by heavy brush and trees, was called Kiowa. Kiowa was one of the more remote units. It had 10 platform tents, each covered with green military-style canvas, sitting on wooden slats elevated above the dirt. There was no electricity. A latrine served the whole unit. And Kiowa sat at the very edge of the property, closest to the boundary fence and the thickest, most tangled part of the woods. Far from the main lodge. Far from the campfire circle. Far from the safety of sound and sight. 3 girls assigned to tent number 8 in the Kiowa unit had never met before. But by nightfall on June 12th, they were bunkmates. Lori Lee Farmer was just 8 years old, the youngest camper at Camp Scott that year. With a beaming smile and a curious mind, Lori was the kind of child who wrote thank you notes unprompted and devoured books beyond her grade level. Her parents, Bo and Sherry Farmer, had initially hesitated to let her go because of her age. But Lori was insistent. Her mother packed her carefully, labeling every item. Lori brought a camera to capture her adventures. Michelle Heather Guza, 9, was quieter, introspective. Her family remembered her as artistic and gentle, with a love of drawing and reading. She had more camping experience than Lori and had attended Camp Scott previously. Michelle was a rule follower. A listener. She liked order and routine. The third girl, Doris Denise Milner, called Denise, was 10 and she had not wanted to come to camp. In the days before her departure, Denise reportedly begged her mother to let her stay home. She said she had a bad feeling. But her mother, in an effort to encourage independence, gently pushed her out the door. Denise was gifted, having skipped a grade, and already deeply aware of the world around her. She'd been involved in her church, and friends described her as bright, thoughtful, and sometimes a little reserved. Together, the 3 of them were placed in tent number 8, the last tent on the trail. The tent farthest from the camp counselor's quarters. It was obscured slightly from view by trees and sat in partial shadow even during the day. On the night of June 12th, the 3 girls organized their sleeping bags, wrote letters home, and settled in as the sky darkened and the wind picked up. That night, a storm swept across Camp Scott. Thunder echoed off the hills. Rain slashed through the trees. Some campers later said they were scared. Others barely slept. The sound of the rain on the tent canvas was hypnotic, rhythmic, like drumming on a hollow shell. Somewhere in the middle of that night, while most of Camp Scott slept, something entered tent number 8. Something that would destroy not just 3 lives, but the illusion that any child is ever truly safe in the woods. In the days to come, counselors would replay the layout of the unit again and again. Why wasn't there a better sight line to tent number 8? Why weren't there patrols? Could anything have stopped it? But by then it was too late. The damage had been done. The innocence had been torn. And Camp Scott, Oklahoma's beloved Girl Scout haven, would never reopen again. Chapter 2: The Discovery. Dawn came slowly to Camp Scott on June 13, 1977. After a night of pounding rain and the occasional crack of thunder echoing across the valley, the woods were drenched and still. The morning air was humid and heavy, clinging to the bark of the trees and to the wet canvas of the girls' tents. The storm had passed, but the quiet it left behind was not the peace one hopes for at summer camp. It was the kind of quiet that waits for someone to notice what's missing. At 6 a.m., camp counselor Carla Wilhite began her early rounds. It was her job to check in on the girls, make sure no one was sick, and get a sense of who was already awake. She walked the Kiowa Trail, her boots squelching in the mud, brushing away low branches heavy with rain. As she passed the latrine, something on the trail caught her eye. It was a sleeping bag. Out of place. Soaked through. Mounded strangely. She stepped closer, heart starting to pick up. And then she saw it, a small foot protruding from the open end of the bag. Pale. Motionless. She screamed. Her cry shattered the morning stillness. It echoed down the trail and through the trees, waking other counselors and drawing several campers out of their tents. Carla fled toward the director's lodge, yelling that something had happened. That something was very wrong. Within minutes, Camp Director Barbara Day was on site, joined by other staff members. They tried to keep the girls away as they approached the bag. Inside was the body of Denise Milner. She had been gagged with duct tape. Her hands were bound with cord. She was partially dressed and had clearly been moved from somewhere else, dragged across the ground to this crude resting place near the latrine. Denise had been murdered. The search for the other 2 girls began immediately. Counselors rushed to tent number 8. What they found inside was confusion and horror. The tent was stained with blood. Supplies were scattered. A flashlight, later recovered and preserved, sat near one of the beds with what appeared to be a red fingerprint on its lens. But the other 2 girls, Lori Farmer and Michelle Guza, were missing. Less than 200 yards away, behind a low embankment in the brush, staff members found 2 more sleeping bags, zipped shut. Inside were the bodies of Lori and Michelle. Both had been beaten and sexually assaulted. Both had been bound with cord. One of them had severe head injuries consistent with being struck repeatedly by a blunt object. Later reports indicated that at least 1 girl had been killed inside the tent, while the others were likely dragged or carried away post-mortem. The camp was locked down. Calls were made. Parents were notified. Police arrived quickly, followed by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the Mays County Sheriff's Office, and eventually the National Guard. By 8 a.m., Camp Scott was no longer a summer retreat. It was a crime scene. News of the triple homicide spread like wildfire through Oklahoma and beyond. Television crews and journalists descended on the camp, setting up outside the gates. Reporters tried to ask the stunned counselors for details. Some cried. Others shook their heads in disbelief. No one could comprehend what had happened. The campers, those who had not yet seen the carnage, were evacuated by bus before noon. Many of them would later remember being confused, or scared, or hurried out before breakfast. Some recalled whispers among the adults. Others recalled the smell of wet canvas and something else, something metallic. Back in Tulsa, the parents of Lori, Michelle, and Denise were contacted. For many, the calls were vague at first. There had been an emergency or an incident. Some parents rushed to the camp only to be turned away at the gates, redirected to nearby hotels or sheriff's offices to await formal notification. The grief that followed was a kind few people ever survive intact. And then came the questions. How had someone gotten into tent number 8? Why wasn't there a counselor nearby? Why hadn't anyone heard screaming? The terrain of Camp Scott didn't help. The dense woods and lack of lighting made visibility almost non-existent past dark. The sound of rain would have drowned out movement. The tents themselves, simple canvas flaps on platforms, offered no protection against an intruder. But there was something else. Just a few weeks before the camp opened, during a pre-summer counselor training weekend, a bizarre incident had occurred. A staff member returned to her tent to find her belongings ransacked. Her donuts had been stolen. In their place, a torn-up note written in crude, almost childlike script. It read, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in Tent 1. The note was taken to camp officials. They assumed it was a joke, a prank, a sick attempt at campfire spookiness. No investigation was conducted. The note was thrown away. Tent number 8 was not Tent 1. But in retrospect, the implication was clear. Someone had threatened the camp, and 3 girls had died. Whether it was a coincidence or a calling card remains unknown. By the end of that day, the FBI was involved. Bloodhounds had been brought in to trace the killer's path. Helicopters swept low over the trees. Police interviewed every camper, counselor, and maintenance worker. They set up checkpoints. They combed the woods. But the killer or killers had vanished. The only thing they left behind was horror and a new fear. If this could happen at a Girl Scout camp in the woods of Oklahoma to children sleeping in their bunks, what couldn't happen? Chapter 3. The Investigation. The search for whoever had killed Lori Farmer, Michelle Guzza, and Denise Milner began before their bodies were even removed from the woods. By mid-morning on June 13, 1977, Camp Scott had been sealed off with yellow tape. The camp's gravel paths, quiet just hours earlier, were now clogged with investigators, evidence technicians, deputies, and dogs. The Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, known as the OSBI, assumed control almost immediately. Mays County Sheriff Pete Weaver, a small-town lawman with decades of service, stood at the center of it all, overwhelmed but determined. He gave a short statement to the press that day. "We're going to find whoever did this. There's no way this man walks free." He sounded certain. But the truth was, they had no idea who they were looking for. They had only fragments of evidence, literal and metaphorical. There was the flashlight found inside tent number 8, its lens partially covered with a red residue. Later, this would be described as a possible fingerprint. There was the duct tape gag used on Denise, pieces of cord, the sleeping bags, blood, hair, semen. No one had worn gloves. And yet, even in 1977, the evidence was frustratingly insufficient. Forensics was primitive. There was no DNA testing. Blood typing could be done, but it only narrowed the suspect pool slightly. Hairs could be analyzed microscopically, but only to suggest similarity, not match. The fingerprint was smudged and partial. The only clear thing about the scene was its brutality and its planning. This was no accident. This was no opportunistic attack. Whoever had entered tent number 8 had done so with preparation and purpose. Within 48 hours, suspicion turned to an escaped convict. His name was Leroy Hart. Hart was a 33-year-old Cherokee man, a former high school football star from the nearby town of Locust Grove. In 1966, he'd been convicted of a grotesque sexual assault. He had abducted 2 pregnant women from Tulsa, driven them into the woods, raped them, bound them with duct tape and cord, and left them for dead in a remote area near Camp Scott. They survived. He was caught, tried, and convicted. But in 1973, Hart escaped from the Mays County Jail and vanished. He had been on the run for 4 years by the time the girls were murdered, hiding, some believed, in the Cookson Hills, aided by a network of supporters in the Cherokee community. His face was known. His file was thick. And his method of assault, the binding with cord and use of tape, matched the elements found at Camp Scott. But suspicion is not proof. Investigators canvassed the area around the camp, searching caves, sheds, abandoned buildings, and deer blinds. Locals were questioned. Hunters, former inmates, tribal leaders. They brought in helicopters, set up roadblocks. Then, about a week after the murders, they found what would later be called the Cave Stash. Less than 2 miles from Camp Scott, deep in the woods, a search team discovered a small cave. Inside were several items: a roll of duct tape, a pair of eyeglasses that matched a pair missing from a counselor's tent, a red nylon rope similar to the cord used to bind the girls, and a photograph of 3 young women, torn at the edges, stuck to the damp stone wall with what appeared to be chewing gum. The OSBI called it a hideout, a makeshift home. Sheriff Weaver called it a sick little den. And Leroy Hart had once been trained as an electrician inside prison. Some of the cord used in the murders, it turned out, had originally been issued to the electrical department in the penitentiary he'd escaped from. It all pointed to him. But again, pointing isn't proving. Still, Weaver doubled down. Hart became the sole suspect. A $20,000 reward was announced. Wanted posters were distributed. Locals joined the search. Some residents, particularly white residents, demanded justice immediately. Others in the Native community resisted. They saw Hart not just as a suspect, but as a symbol of injustice. Many believed he was being railroaded. And with no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene, the case against him was far from airtight. Nonetheless, the manhunt intensified. The OSBI, with support from the FBI, turned to informants and surveillance. For 9 months, Hart evaded capture, moving from place to place, allegedly protected by sympathizers. He was said to sleep in caves, in cabins, in barns, always one step ahead, until April 6, 1978. On that day, authorities, following a tip from an informant, raided a remote shack deep in the Cookson Hills. Inside, they found Hart, tired, bearded, unarmed. He did not resist. When asked if he had anything to say, Hart replied only, "I guess it had to happen sometime." He was taken back to jail, the very same one he'd escaped from in 1973. And there, in a tiny holding cell, he waited while prosecutors prepared a case against him for the murders of 3 little girls. Public opinion was divided. Some saw the arrest as a relief closure. Others called it a witch hunt. A small but vocal movement formed around Hart's defense, made up of tribal advocates, former classmates, and legal activists. They raised money, hired lawyers, claimed the state was desperate for a scapegoat. In Mayes County, though, the feeling was simpler. The monster had a name: Chapter 4, the trial and the acquittal. It took nearly a year for prosecutors to build their case. Gene Leroy Hart, arrested in April of 1978, was already a convicted felon, already a fugitive, and already infamous in Oklahoma. But trying him for the murders at Camp Scott was something else entirely. This wasn't just a trial, it was a referendum on fear, on race, on justice, and on the limits of evidence in an age before DNA. The state of Oklahoma charged Hart with 3 counts of first-degree murder. He entered a plea of not guilty. The trial was moved to Cherokee County due to overwhelming publicity in Mayes County, but the media followed anyway. Reporters from across the country packed the courthouse in Tahlequah, a town of just 10,000 people and the capital of the Cherokee Nation. Cameras were barred from the courtroom, but the headlines made sure no one missed a detail. The state's theory was simple, if chilling. They argued that Hart, living as a fugitive in the woods near Camp Scott, had stalked the grounds for days, possibly weeks. That he entered tent number 8 during the storm on June 12, 1977, under cover of darkness and thunder, and murdered Lori Farmer, Michelle Guza, and Denise Milner. That he then dragged their bodies into the brush, concealed them in sleeping bags, and disappeared back into the woods. They pointed to Hart's prior crimes: the binding, the duct tape, the secluded forest attacks. They brought in testimony about the items found in the cave: tape, rope, glasses. They even mentioned the note found weeks before the murders, warning that 3 girls would be killed, though they had no handwriting match to Hart. The physical evidence, however, was weak. There was no blood tying him to the scene. The fingerprint on the flashlight couldn't be definitively matched to Hart. None of the hair or fiber samples recovered offered a clear connection. The semen evidence, limited by the technology of the time, could only determine blood type, and even that was inconclusive. Still, the prosecution hammered the narrative: same M.O., same methods, same region. The defense, led by Garvin Isaacs, countered with an aggressive strategy. They leaned heavily on the lack of forensic proof. They cast doubt on the crime scene integrity, suggesting that Camp Scott had been too chaotic, too compromised in the hours after the bodies were found. Chain of custody? Unclear. Contamination? Possible. Alternative suspects? Not ruled out. Most significantly, they raised the issue of bias. They argued that Hart, a full-blooded Cherokee man, was being scapegoated by a white-dominated law enforcement system desperate for resolution. His 1966 conviction, they argued, had already made him an easy villain in the eyes of the public. His escape had embarrassed local authorities. His arrest had made good headlines. But guilt? That, they claimed, had never been proven. Day after day, the courtroom filled with spectators. Some were families of victims. Others were locals curious to see the man accused of killing 3 children. Hart, calm and quiet throughout, sat in a pale button-down shirt, flanked by his attorneys, expression unreadable. The mothers of the victims sat together. Sherry Farmer, Lori's mother, later said the hardest part wasn't the testimony, it was seeing Hart in person. Sitting there, breathing, living. The trial lasted several weeks. On March 30, 1979, after just over 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The verdict: not guilty on all counts. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Hart smiled briefly. His attorney patted him on the back. The families of the victims stared straight ahead, stunned. Outside the courthouse, a cheer went up. Dozens of Hart's supporters, many from the Cherokee Nation, had gathered in solidarity. To them, this was justice. Vindication. A man falsely accused had beaten the system. But to the families of the girls, it was a second blow. A second loss. Their children had died, and the man they believed responsible was now free of any murder charge. Yet Hart was not truly free. He was returned to prison to serve out the remainder of his 300-plus-year sentence from his previous convictions. He had escaped from custody in 1973. He'd been on the run for nearly 5 years. That still carried weight, still demanded time, but he wouldn't serve much more of it. On June 4, 1979, just 2 months after his acquittal, Leroy Hart was playing handball in the prison yard at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. After the game, he collapsed. He was pronounced dead of a massive heart attack shortly after. He was 35 years old. No autopsy was performed at the family's request. Some saw his death as karmic justice, others as tragedy. The Oklahoma Attorney General's office, reeling from the failed prosecution, quietly closed its case file. There would be no retrial, no confession, no second chance. The man accused of murdering Lori, Michelle, and Denise was gone. And the girls? Buried. Gone longer now than they had lived. But their mothers and fathers, year after year, kept asking the same question. If it wasn't Hart, then who? Chapter 5: DNA Delays and Doubt. When Leroy Hart collapsed and died in the prison yard in the summer of 1979, many believed that the story of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders had ended. The trial was over. The prime suspect was gone. For the state, there was no longer a case to pursue. For the press, the headline had faded. For the general public, the horror of what had happened at Camp Scott became a macabre footnote. Tragic, yes, but closed. But for the families of Lori Farmer, Michelle Guza, and Denise Milner, nothing was closed. And nothing had been answered. They had buried their daughters. They had sat through the trial. They had watched the man accused of killing them walk out of a courtroom unconvicted, and then, weeks later, collapse and die. They had waited year after year for someone to step forward. A witness. A jailhouse confession. A piece of evidence overlooked. Anything. What they got instead was silence. Camp Scott was never reopened. The land was sold. The tents were removed. The Girl Scouts of Eastern Oklahoma quietly moved on, offering other summer programs in other places. Some of the girls who had attended that session in 1977 never returned to scouting. Others talked about it only in hushed tones, if at all. The collective trauma was sealed behind platitudes and plaques. What remained was a scar that the state itself seemed to want to forget. But science hadn't forgotten. By the early 1990s, forensic science had begun to advance at a staggering pace. DNA analysis, once considered the stuff of science fiction, had become a viable tool in criminal investigations. Blood could be typed. Skin cells could be analyzed. Semen samples, properly preserved, could be matched to individual suspects with near-perfect accuracy. The evidence collected at Camp Scott, some of it, at least, had been kept carefully. Somewhere in the state's cold case archives, there were envelopes and vials and slides that hadn't been touched in decades. In 2008, over 30 years after the murders, the case was reopened for forensic re-examination. It was a slow process. First, OSBI analysts had to determine whether the evidence had degraded beyond use. The samples, mostly semen stains on pillowcases and sleeping bags, had been stored using 1970s procedures, which didn't always account for moisture, bacteria, or contamination. Some items were compromised. Others were intact. New testing began. In 2011, the OSBI announced that they had obtained DNA results from some of the biological evidence. Those results were compared to DNA from living relatives of Leroy Hart, since he had no direct samples on file. The results were both promising and frustrating. The DNA in question could not definitively match Hart, but it also could not rule him out. One analyst described it as a partial profile consistent with Hart's known markers. That phrasing was vague, and it had to be. Without a full DNA sample from Hart himself, all the science could say was, this could have been him, or someone else with a similar genetic background. And because the testing was partial, just fragments of a full genetic fingerprint, it could not be used in a courtroom. To the state, the case remained unsolved. But the families weren't done. Sherry Farmer, Lori's mother, began pushing for further testing. More advanced techniques. More outside eyes. She reached out to journalists, to podcasters, to private labs. For decades she had remained composed and quiet. Now she was angry. She wanted answers. The public, too, began to take new interest. As the true crime genre exploded in the 2010s, thanks to shows like Serial and Making a Murderer, the Girl Scout murders were rediscovered by a new generation. Documentaries were proposed. Podcasts revisited the case. Reddit threads dug deep into the details. Was the killer someone else? Was Hart truly guilty? Was there a cover-up? Some amateur sleuths pointed to possible alternate suspects. Others re-examined Hart's timeline and concluded he could not have committed the crime. A few even theorized that the killer was someone from inside Camp Scott, someone who knew the terrain, the routines, the units. But none of those theories could be proven, and the only DNA on file still pointed, however weakly, to Hart. Then, in May 2022, after years of silence, the current Mays County Sheriff, Mike Reed, held a press conference. Standing behind a lectern in front of the courthouse in Pryor, Reed announced that he believed the case was closed. "Unless something new comes up," he said, "we have our man." He was referring to Hart. Based on the totality of evidence, both old and newly tested, Sheriff Reed believed that Hart had, in fact, been the killer. The DNA, he claimed, while not courtroom grade, was persuasive enough when combined with the cave stash, the history of the crime, and Hart's previous assaults. But critics were quick to push back. Some called it political. Others pointed out that the partial DNA could just as easily be consistent with thousands of Native men in the region. Still others argued that declaring a case solved without charges, conviction, or confession was dangerous. The state, for its part, made no move to reopen the prosecution. Hart, long dead, could not defend himself or confess. And so the question remains, was Gene Leroy Hart truly the man who slipped into tent number 8 that night? Or did someone else, still unknown, carry out one of the most horrifying crimes in Oklahoma history and vanish into the trees, unseen, unpunished, and free? Closing. The camp that never reopened. The tents are gone now. So are the fire pits, the canoe racks, the faded wooden signs nailed to tree trunks with names like Kiowa, Choctaw, and Arapaho. The dining hall has been dismantled. The trails overgrown. The laughter silenced. No one sings campfire songs on those grounds anymore. No one writes home about bug juice or lanyard bracelets or the thrill of sleeping under the stars. Camp Scott never reopened. It exists now only in memory and in nightmares. For the families of Lori Farmer, Michelle Guza, and Denise Milner, the summer of 1977 did not end. It froze in place. A smudge on a map. A gap in the calendar. A week that never finished. The kind of wound that doesn't scar, it stays raw. They lost their daughters not to illness, not to accident, but to something far crueler. A predator, an invader of childhood, who walked into the woods with a plan and left without consequence. The girls' gravestones sit in different cemeteries now, scattered across Oklahoma. Lori's is pink granite, etched with flowers. Michelle's has a small photo inset into the stone, her smile preserved in a school portrait. Denise's is sleek, modern, adorned with her full name and the dates that mark the shortest of lives. Their parents became reluctant figures of endurance. They were not activists by choice, but by necessity. They went to hearings, gave interviews, waited for phone calls that never came. Every few years, the story would resurface, on anniversaries, in retrospectives, in courtrooms where their daughters' names were invoked without them being present. The state of Oklahoma calls the case inactive, but not closed. But what does that mean to a mother who held her child's hand on a bus and never saw her again? What does it mean to a father who watched the trial, believing, needing, justice only to hear a jury say the words, "Not guilty"? What does it mean to a counselor who woke up to a scream and found that the camp she thought was safe had been invaded by something unspeakable? Decades later, there are still those who visit the site. Hikers, hunters, pilgrims of tragedy. They say the woods are quiet, heavy with age and memory. Some say they've seen remnants, nails in trees, traces of platform outlines, bits of foundation swallowed by vines. But most of Camp Scott has been reclaimed by nature. What once was for children is now for shadows. And yet the question lingers like mist over Lake Fort Gibson. Who killed the girls in Tent 8? Gene Leroy Hart is dead. The state says he did it. Some forensic experts agree. Others do not. Without a confession, without airtight proof, without a single voice to rise from that dark night and say, "I saw him," the truth remains elusive. Hart supporters maintain his innocence to this day. They speak of planted evidence, of scapegoating, of how quickly law enforcement zeroed in on him, ignoring other leads, of how broken the system was then, and still is. But supporters of the victims' families and many investigators believe the case was closed long ago. That the monster who entered the woods was known, was caught, and died with his secrets intact. That DNA, though flawed and partial, whispers the truth even when it cannot scream it. Still, the whispers aren't enough. The Oklahoma Girl Scout murders remain one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history. Not because the evidence is lacking, but because the absence of justice still feels like its own kind of violence. 3 girls. 1 night. No answers. But none of those theories could be proven, and the only DNA on file still pointed, however weakly, to Hart. Then, in May 2022, after years of silence, the current Mays County Sheriff, Mike Reed, held a press conference. Standing behind a lectern in front of the courthouse in Pryor, Reed announced that he believed the case was closed. "Unless something new comes up," he said, "we have our man." He was referring to Hart. Based on the totality of evidence, both old and newly tested, Sheriff Reed believed that Hart had, in fact, been the killer. The DNA, he claimed, while not courtroom grade, was persuasive enough when combined with the cave stash, the history of the crime, and Hart's previous assaults. But critics were quick to push back. Some called it political. Others pointed out that the partial DNA could just as easily be consistent with thousands of Native men in the region. Still others argued that declaring a case solved without charges, conviction, or confession was dangerous. The state, for its part, made no move to reopen the prosecution. Hart, long dead, could not defend himself or confess. And so the question remains: was Gene Leroy Hart truly the man who slipped into tent number 8 that night? Or did someone else, still unknown, carry out one of the most horrifying crimes in Oklahoma history and vanish into the trees, unseen, unpunished, and free? Closing. The camp that never reopened. The tents are gone now. So are the fire pits, the canoe racks, the faded wooden signs nailed to tree trunks with names like Kiowa, Choctaw, and Arapaho. The dining hall has been dismantled. The trails overgrown. The laughter silenced. No one sings campfire songs on those grounds anymore. No one writes home about bug juice or lanyard bracelets or the thrill of sleeping under the stars. Camp Scott never reopened. It exists now only in memory and in nightmares. For the families of Lori Farmer, Michelle Guza, and Denise Milner, the summer of 1977 did not end. It froze in place. A smudge on a map. A gap in the calendar. A week that never finished. The kind of wound that doesn't scar, it stays raw. They lost their daughters not to illness, not to accident, but to something far crueler. A predator, an invader of childhood, who walked into the woods with a plan and left without consequence. The girls' gravestones sit in different cemeteries now, scattered across Oklahoma. Lori's is pink granite, etched with flowers. Michelle's has a small photo inset into the stone, her smile preserved in a school portrait. Denise's is sleek, modern, adorned with her full name and the dates that mark the shortest of lives. Their parents became reluctant figures of endurance. They were not activists by choice, but by necessity. They went to hearings, gave interviews, waited for phone calls that never came. Every few years, the story would resurface, on anniversaries, in retrospectives, in courtrooms where their daughters' names were invoked without them being present. The state of Oklahoma calls the case inactive, but not closed. But what does that mean to a mother who held her child's hand on a bus and never saw her again? What does it mean to a father who watched the trial believing, needing justice only to hear a jury say the words, "Not guilty"? What does it mean to a counselor who woke up to a scream and found that the camp she thought was safe had been invaded by something unspeakable? Decades later, there are still those who visit the site. Hikers, hunters, pilgrims of tragedy. They say the woods are quiet, heavy with age and memory. Some say they've seen remnants, nails in trees, traces of platform outlines, bits of foundation swallowed by vines. But most of Camp Scott has been reclaimed by nature. What once was for children is now for shadows. And yet the question lingers, like mist over Lake Fort Gibson. Who killed the girls in Tent 8? Gene Leroy Hart is dead. The state says he did it. Some forensic experts agree. Others do not. Without a confession, without airtight proof, without a single voice to rise from that dark night and say, "I saw him," the truth remains elusive. Hart supporters maintain his innocence to this day. They speak of planted evidence, of scapegoating, of how quickly law enforcement zeroed in on him, ignoring other leads. Of how broken the system was then, and still is. But supporters of the victims' families and many investigators believe the case was closed long ago. That the monster who entered the woods was known, was caught, and died with his secrets intact. That DNA, though flawed and partial, whispers the truth even when it cannot scream it. Still, the whispers aren't enough. The Oklahoma Girl Scout murders remain one of the most haunting unsolved cases in American history. Not because the evidence is lacking, but because the absence of justice still feels like its own kind of violence. 3 girls. One night. No answers. This has been AI True Crime.